What if I told you that the very anti-Semitism that fueled Adolf Hitler's rise also resulted in his downfall? Now, this probably isn't going to be very much of a shock to most of you out there, but at the same time, this is a compilation of facts that, if you add them all together, lead to this very natural conclusion. So let's start with his rise. Of course, Adolf Hitler's rise, his entire ideology was fueled by a book that he wrote in captivity in 1922 called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. And Hitler basically telegraphed his entire ideology in this book, considering obviously Jews as inferior. Same for Russians and the Soviet Union. He harbored much hatred towards Bolshevism and the Soviet communism, which in turn would telegraph his future invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, almost 20 years later. And I'm sure Stalin read the book, but for some reason he didn't believe this, but it was telegraphed 20 years earlier that this would happen. Which, of course, was another factor in his downfall, his overreach. Now, this belief will run throughout his entire reign as Führer of Germany. Hitler was actually appointed as Chancellor, or basically the leader of Parliament, by the president in 1936, or it's not 1936, but it was 1933. Paul von Hindenburg, the president of Germany, a World War I hero in his own right, appointed Hitler as Chancellor under some interesting pressure dynamics. And so Hitler became Chancellor, and then Hindenburg died in 1934, so he only lived another year. And Hindenburg, with his passing, went any constitutional restraints on Hitler's power. Hitler later on that year had the Enabling Act passed, which gave him dictatorial powers, and from there it all went downhill. Now, you got to keep this belief of his in mind, that Russians, any Slavic people, and Jews were inferior or subhuman, basically. Although he invaded Poland, a Slavic people, in 1939, and his conquests were substantial from 1939 to 1941. Blitzkrieg, they called it. Lightning War. He had all of continental Europe conquered by 1941. He had invaded France, considered the second biggest military in Europe, conquered it relatively quickly within weeks. The Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands also fell, as did Denmark, as did Norway, as did Austria. Austria, of course, being a Germanic-speaking country. He conquered and had military conquered them, but he treated the Austrians a little bit differently than the rest, because first of all, Hitler's actually a native Austrian. He was born in Innsbruck, Austria. As you know, he wasn't born there. He was born in Salzburg, and spent a considerable time of his youth in Vienna. And so Hitler had conquered all of continental Europe by this point, including Greece, and he didn't actually own Italy per se, but obviously his erstwhile ally in Mussolini controlled Italy. So he basically had sway over all of continental Europe and actually even much of North Africa at this point, which then led to the North Africa campaigns in 1943 to liberate those countries: Tunisia, Libya, Egypt. Morocco actually didn't fall to the Nazis ever. Morocco has, even in the past and even now, is a substantial U.S. ally. But Hitler's at the peak of his powers. And here's where the downfall starts. And here's where his belief of Aryan superiority comes into play and basically takes the whole thing down. As I've mentioned on this channel before, Hitler had many advisors warning of the Soviets and the Western Allies' artillery, manpower, etc., superiority that they held over Nazi Germany at the time, anytime from 1943 to 1945. He had men like Albert Speer, the armaments minister, telling him that that America could outproduce the entire Axis alliance, including Italy and Japan, combined by themselves. And in terms of planes and bombers is concerned, they could do it at one factory, Willow Run in Michigan. Hitler, believing that the Western Allies were weak, democracy was inferior to fascism, he completely blew off Speer and said that's impossible because these people are not capable of these things. This is political delusion serving to block the truth. We all know what happened in production terms in the last 2 years of the war. The Americans, and to some extent the rest of the Western Allies, crushed Germany. Hitler lost the war on armaments and manpower. Speaking of manpower, here comes the Soviet Union. A people that Hitler considered absolutely incapable of anything. He believed them to be that inferior. He completely underestimated their defensive capabilities and their overwhelming, and I mean overwhelming. Did I say overwhelming? Numerical superiority to Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany being a country of maybe 50 million people. The Soviets at this time had 125 million people. They had armies that could be drafted or even called up that were already enlisted. Almost, you could line them up man for man and they could almost reach across the entire country, almost all the way to the Bering Sea. 125 million men. Imagine hands across America being hands across the Soviet Union. This would be a manpower train that should have been frightening to Hitler. But instead what he saw was an inferior, incapable people, incapable of any sort of thing that could possibly threaten him. He ignored the numbers. He ignored the production realities. The Soviets, by the way, in 1943 did something that was very much a masterstroke. Stalin was absolutely brilliant for doing this. And of course, in 1943, this happened in 1942. Just as the Nazis were at the height of their powers. Here's what he did. Stalin moved wartime production eastward across the Ural Mountains and into continental Asia, out of physical reach of the Wehrmacht and Hitler's armed forces. And this is hundreds of kilometers east. The immense reach that Hitler would have had to have undertaken just to reach these production facilities was absolutely absurd. He didn't have what Ukraine has now as far as destroying Russian productivity. Drones didn't exist in the 1940s. He didn't have what Ukraine has now. Ukraine, of course, being another Slavic people that he felt to be inferior. They figured very heavily in the Soviet turnaround of World War II in Europe. It was, after all, the first first Ukrainian front and first Belarusian front, Belarus, that being Belarus today. Slavic peoples that Hitler felt were inferior had millions of soldiers. They arrived at Berlin with 2 million. The Germans had maybe less than a third of that in their defense in 1945. But Hitler believed that these were bumbling idiots who could not possibly have accomplished anything, much to his demise. This cost him the war. The very hatred and underestimation under racial pretenses that caused him to gain popularity and gain power within Germany caused him to lose the country several years later. He simply just believed in Aryan superiority to the point that he just believed that he couldn't lose. Which is why, carrying on to the next step, Hitler ordered German forces to never surrender and to simply go sheerly on willpower, because that would be enough to win. Because his opponents were so inferior that they could not possibly carry on sufficient opposition to his armed forces, which include both the Wehrmacht and the SS by this point. He just believed that the Russian and Soviet peoples were just that inferior. They were inferior to the point where he killed many of them as he made his conquests across the Western Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942. The Holocaust occurred in Russia too. Bet you didn't know that, huh? Tens of thousands of Soviet Jews were killed by German invaders on the orders of course, some of the invading soldiers were Himmler's SS. They conducted the Holocaust back home in Germany and in Poland. They did the same as they conquered territory in the Soviet Union. And they raped and pillaged and stole from Soviet peoples. This led to Stalin's next masterstroke, which was the scorched earth theory. You hear scorched earth policies these days. That started with Stalin. The goal being to destroy his own villages and his own infrastructure to the point where by the time the Wehrmacht and the SS reached him, there was nothing left for them to take. Mass evacuations of villages went eastbound across the Urals along with the production facilities. They basically gave Germany a good chunk of the Russian plains, modern-day Ukraine. Stalin just said, "Here you go, but we're not going to leave you. We're not going to leave you a thing. We're just going to. Here you go." And they left this. They left it pretty much open all the way to Stalingrad. It wasn't a massive conquering raid. The Germans basically just ran all the way to Stalingrad, which then later, as is famously known now, became their death trap. From there, after they got defeated, surrounded, and in the case of Paulus's 6th Panzer Army, got virtually entirely wiped out. And in those same open plains and those same empty lands, the Soviets then were able to just shove the Germans back with no physical obstacles in the way other than the Germans themselves. And of course, one racial aspect of things that, or non-racial aspect of things that Hitler did not consider, which of course Napoleon failed to consider in 1812, was the Russian winter. Weather has no race. Because it has no race, Hitler's underestimation of that had nothing to do with Soviet people, but he just simply refused. Because of the racial underestimation that dominated his thoughts in 1942, he just thought that the Russians would... Hitler had a quote: "All we have to do is knock on the door and the entire rotten structure will come down." He thoroughly believed that the Soviet Union was rotten at its core because it was populated by Slavic people. And he also thought that because of Russia's invasion of Finland ending so badly for them in 1941, that he could just take him out with ease, because he thought that to be Finnish racial superiority going against Soviet racial inferiority. That was not true. The reason why the Russians lost that particular war or invasion themselves also had to do with weather conditions. Of course, Finland being an Arctic country, Russia was an Arctic country too, but the problem for Stalin in that particular case is simply that Finland had home field advantage. The defenders are always going to have home field advantage. And because they're both equally Arctically equipped, home field advantage actually was the deciding factor. As both countries had Arctic training and had Arctic experience. But it was Finland's land. They knew it better than the Russians did, so they used that to their advantage. It wasn't that Russia was incapable or the racial background made them inferior attackers. It was just basic weather, facts, and home field advantage that cost Russia that particular invasion. The invasion is still sticks in Finland's mind today, as they have now joined NATO in the past year. So Hitler had maintained this racial anti-Semitic thoughts all the way until he took himself out in the fear bunker. He insisted that nobody surrenders at all, because he just simply believed that the Russians were capable, and he believed that Aryan superiority would carry the day based on basic willpower alone. Obviously, we now know that that was patently false. The numbers were against him tremendously. People like Speer gave him the facts. People like Gotthard Heinrici, who was part of Operation Barbarossa and then part of the defense of Berlin later on. Heinrici, Hitler's best defensive general, even told him as they were getting beat all the way back to Berlin, back across the Oder River, and back to the Seelow Heights, that we can't beat these guys. We need to negotiate something ASAP. And of course, this was treason to Hitler, because he just simply believed that Aryan superiority would carry the day automatically. Numerical and armament strength be damned. So Heinrici was written off as a traitor. Speer was written off as a defeatist. And even Helmuth Weiling, in his defense of Berlin, knew and even told Hitler that he was asking him for the impossible. He knew he was being asked of the impossible. He dutifully attempted anyway, but Weiling got his mercy from the racial delusions of Hitler when Hitler took himself out on April 30th of 1945 in the Fuhrer bunker. And so at this point, Hitler's racial delusions were no longer in effect, and as a result, Weitling was free to surrender, and he did on May 2nd of 1945. So this is a story of how the very racial delusions that caused Hitler's rise also caused his demise. It's Sunday morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm off to do Sunday things shortly. Off to church. Not volunteering this week. Going as myself. I'm just hoping you all have a great Sunday and a great rest of the weekend too. You folks enjoy your time and peace out, homies.